Hello, this is Helen Thomas and the CDFM study group. I want to now go over CDFM Module 2, Competency 2, which is Cost and Economic Analysis. I will be reviewing the 2020 study guide. All right, let's go on page 225. So this is a continuation of the defense budget process. So now we're going to be looking at the cost and economic analysis and how it plays in the budget process. Now, if you notice on page 5, they begin with the 3 DoD support systems that we already discussed in 2.5. The Department of Defense have 3 systems that overlap. The operation of all 3 systems work and they overlap to meet the National Defense Strategy. Remember, everything big up order is the National Security Strategy. Then the DoD pulls out all the defense-related items out of the NSS and develops the National Defense Strategy. And then DoD uses those 3 circles, those 3 systems, JCIDS, PPBE, and the Defense Acquisition System to then work to accomplish the National Defense Strategy. So remember the purpose of JCIDS. Joint Capabilities Integration and Development System is done by the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, who is the Chairman of JROC, and then the JROC with the Joint Vice Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff does an analysis. So once they determine the strategy, National Defense Strategy, the JROC with the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff begins this analytical process to determine what capabilities do we have to meet the strategy and what capability gaps do we have. Because we may or may not have everything we need to meet the strategy. So what JCIDS is looking at is the .MLPF, Doctrine, Organization, Training, Material, all the way down to facilities. They look at each one of those areas to determine if there's a capability gap, where is that gap? So if it's a material solution with the EL, then it triggers the acquisition system. If it's any of the other ones, then they typically move on to the PPBE process. So you could kind of see how the systems overlap. Now understand that the acquisition system has to overlap also with PPBE because that's how you get the funding. You can only get the money through the budgeting estimate submission. So I wanted to recap that piece of the pie. So what this section is about is on the acquisition side, looking at costs, looking at how you come up with cost estimates. Once you determine what that capability gap is, now you need to look at how you're going to pay for it. How much is it going to cost? How much is it going to cost to build it? Or how much is it going to cost to buy it? So that's what you're looking at. So this is a snapshot of what happens in Module 4 with the acquisition system process. So on page 8 and 9, there's a lot of information there. So I will recommend that you take your time to understand that you need to know in order the different phases, what happens in that phase, the different milestones and the decision points, what decisions are being made. So understanding the acquisition process, they're not just going straight from cradle to grave, developing it all the way to destroying the item. There has to be checkpoints. So that's what a milestone is, a decision point, a checkpoint to then look over the data, look over the cost, performance, the timeline, the schedule to see how long they said they were going to do it. And is it what we want to still pay for? Do we want to still pay for this? Is that capability on paper able to do what we want it to do? Is it able to fill that capability gap that we found in JCIDS? So the JROC provides their recommendation to the field. SecDef This is the capability gaps that we have to meet the strategy. These are our recommendation for solutions to fix the problem. When they issue the solution, it is published on a document called the Initial Capabilities Document, the ICD. You'll see the ICD later, but I'm mentioning it here so that you can see how it plays into the process. So JACES is complete. The ICD is published to determine what the capability solution, gap solution is, and how it needs to be done. So on page 8, you start with the material solution. We take the ICD, we see what the recommendation was from the JROC to say to fix the problem. So we do an analysis, materials analysis. We come up with our key attributes, parameters, timelines, schedules, courses of actions. So in order to come up with courses of action, I need to know what the objective is. So I need to know what all these things are so that we can come up in the material solution analysis phase. We can determine what type of courses of actions we need to develop. So all of this is happening in the material solution analysis phase. We use RDT&E funding in the material solution analysis, research and development, technology and equipment, because you're early on in a stage, and you'll see this again with a dollar amount in the back. I just like to put all the information in one area so that I can remember better. So let's see, I've covered everything. The purpose of material solution analysis, so you need to know the purpose of the phase, is to conduct analysis to choose the concept of the product that we want to fill that capability gap. We want to include the key performance parameters, that's what I already said, key systems attribute, and then you want to look at analysis of the alternatives. Analysis of the alternative is the same thing as your courses of action. Most people are familiar with COAs. So after the material solution analysis is completed, they're looking at risk analysis, they're looking at cost, they're looking at schedule. All of that is war gaming in the analysis of the alternative. Once that is complete, the data is published, given to the milestone decision authority, that's the person in charge of that acquisition. And then you move on to milestone A. So milestone A is a decision point to determine, with the data that they have for material solution analysis, do we want to move forward? So at milestone A, it says a decision approves program entry into the next phase. So in order to get to technology maturation and risk reduction, you have to do milestone A. That's what that's saying there. What's key here is to remember that a favorable milestone A does not mean that they go straight into a full-fledged acquisition system, acquisition program. So that's something important. During milestone A, once they have on paper what this capability needs to look like, that means you're also going to be developing your performance work statement, your request for proposal from contractors. You're starting to build that because you need to let the contractors know these are the specs that we're looking for. So RFPs, request for proposals, is what you're building so that you can ask the contractor to see if they can fill it. So in milestone A, they make a decision. All right, let's go to the next phase. The next phase is technology maturation and risk reduction. So we're moving on with the technology. So when you're talking acquisition, think of the big item things, the aircraft. Think of vehicles, up-armored Humvee, LRIPs, any of those large vehicles, systems, computer systems, cyber systems. Those are what we're dealing with when we talk about cost and economic analysis. So in technology maturation, where you also use RDT&E funding to do it, is the purpose of this phase is you're looking at ways to reduce your risk, technology risk, engineering risk, life cycle cost risk. Risk reduction, as it says in the name, technology maturation. As you move along the process, there's risk associated with every decision that is made. So technology maturation and risk reduction is the phase where they try to reduce those risks, schedule risks, performance, cost risk, life cycle cost risk. Then at the top of page 229, we go into milestone B. Remember, decision point. After every phase, there's a decision point. So material solution analysis, milestone A, technology maturation and risk reduction phase to reduce your risk, and then we move to milestone B. So there's a few things that happen here at milestone B. And remember, this part of the module 2 accounts for, I think, 17% of the questions on it. So it's not a whole lot, even though it's a lot of information. You want to, I'm just pausing right here because I just thought about it. I think fiscal law is like 37%. I think the defense budget process is like 34%. This part is like 17, and I think the last part is like 12 or 14. I have to look at my sheet and I'll update you guys. But you can go to the ASMC website and look at how the test is broken down. You want to know how the test is broken down so that you know where you need to focus the majority of your energy. So I say all that to say, since this is only accounts for 17% of the exam, know this as best you can, but don't overwhelm yourself to the point where you forget the larger sections. All right, so moving back to page 229, the milestone B approves program entry into the next phase, which we already said, a milestone before the next phase. It's responsible for the component EMD contract. Milestone B, important, is the formal initiation of an acquisition program. So this is the point where when you get to milestone B and they approve it, that means we're moving ahead with the program. So if they say when is the program acquisition program initiated, it is a full-fledged acquisition program once you complete milestone B. Some other things in here, as you will see, is the program manager will develop an acquisition program baseline. So now we have everything on paper. This is what the solution is. This is what we think is going to fix it. But we have program managers. They are subject matter experts on those systems or systems like what we're trying to do. So we need a baseline. The program manager can tell you what the specs of, the technical specs of the item. Does it match what the recommendations were? Because remember, the people developing the solution, they're not the program manager. So they're just coming up with their best guess on what they think the solution is. So in the milestone B, the acquisition program baseline is created by the program manager to show the milestone decision authority. Okay, I see what you want to do, but based on what you told me you want to do, here are the specs. Here is the baseline, your starting point for the program. So that's an agreement between the milestone decision authority and the program manager. Also in milestone B, you will see in that paragraph that they determine the lowest quantity of items they're going to initially produce. It's called the LRIP, low rate initial production. So the LRIP is a quantity of the initial amount. You don't want to say, okay, we need to create 200 of these items. Let's create all 200 up front. No, you don't know if it's going to work. So you want to create, if you say your LRIP will create 20 to determine, so you build like prototypes at first. When you're doing your technology maturation, you're building prototypes, you're testing them. And then eventually when you get to production, you're not going to produce the whole 200, you're just going to produce 100. whatever the LRIP is. So in milestone B, they determine what that quantity is going to be. And then once the decisions are made in milestone B, the information is documented in an acquisition decision memorandum, the ADM. So all of that is in milestone B. So successful decision point, they said milestone B, everything looks good. Let's move on to engineering and manufacturing development phase on page 9. The entry into this phase, successful decision point at milestone B. The purpose of this phase is to develop, build, and test product. We're engineering it. We're developing it. We're building it. We're producing it. We're going to test it to make sure it meets our requirements. So that's when you actually apply the key attributes. You're testing it based on those key attributes and key parameters that were established in the beginning, in the material solution phase. So EMD, the types of funding used for EMD, because each phase you need to know what type of money is being used. So we said that material solution analysis and technology maturation risk reduction uses RDT&E. When you move on to engineering and manufacturing development, you use RDT&E, and at some point you also use procurement dollars. So the next milestone is milestone C. Milestone C and the limited deployment decision. Because remember, we already got the limited quantity, the low quantity, but we need a decision for everything that is done before it is done or right before it's done. There's a decision point. So at milestone B and the limited deployment decision, so a decision at milestone B to move on to produce that LRIP is done so that we can enter into the production and deployment phase. In production and deployment, you use procurement and MILCON funding. Production and deployment use procurement and MILCON funding. So the purpose of this phase is to achieve operational capability. Now we're producing them to the point where we're ready. We want them to have an actual end product that we can send out to the warfighter, the test. So you have the operational test and evaluation is being conducted, right? You got to test these things to make sure that the solution does indeed fill that capability gap. So the MDA is your milestone decision authority. That's your senior acquisition person, makes the decision to commit to production and deployment. And it also enables the program into the LRIP, meaning now they can actually produce the number. Remember that quantity that they established in milestone B? Now in production, they can actually produce that low rate initial production. And what they're saying in the production and deployment phase is that in order to move to full rate production later on, they have to also do another decision point, which is called the full rate production decision point. But before we get down there, let's continue looking through what other information is in. So we said the OT&E, operational test and evaluation, is conducted, because we're going to be, initially we got to test the items, but in order to test them, now we got to develop the LRIP, produce the LRIP, so we can send them out. During the P&D phase, the program achieves initial operational capability. So when you develop the LRIP, the low rate, the lowest amount of quantity that was established, now you can move and get into that initial operational capability. Full rate production decision or full deployment decision is another decision point that is technically a part of the production and deployment phase. And it is not a milestone. So you only have milestone A, B, and C. But remember, C was done, then we did production. But part of the production and deployment phase is at some point to do the full rate production. Once they do the low rate, then they want to do the full rate to see are they ready to move forward with the full development. This is an extremely important decision point because the MDA has to conduct a review to assess the results of all the testing. Look at your testing results. How was the performance? How do they interact with the warfighter? Is it meeting the warfighter needs? Is it filling that capability gap? The final phase is operations and support on the bottom of page 229. The purpose of the ONS phase is to execute the product. So operations and support is now to be able to develop the total amount. If we said 200 was what we were going to develop, now we're going to develop the full 200 or the remaining 180 since we built that initial 20 already. So that's the purpose. Know the purpose of each phase. There are two major things and two major efforts that happens in operations and support, which is sustainment and disposal. We can produce and develop the items, put them into operation, but we need to be able to sustain them. We need to be able to put them, to maintain them, do maintenance. And then we need to, at some point, because everything has a life cycle, that means that they're usable product, for it to be a usable product up to a certain date, then there has to be a way to dispose of that item. So you have the disposal. Operations and support phase. Hold on. Operations and support phase uses, let's see, O&M and MILPERS funding. So you need to know the funding, O&M and MILPERS. And if you flip to page 2 to 10, that chart is giving you the dollar amount with the phase. So what I did in my book was next to the phase, I went ahead and wrote the dollar amount so that I can tie the dollar amount directly with the phase in front of me that I'm studying, that I'm reviewing. So that's the information when I told you RDT&E, RDT&E, RDT&E and procurement, MILCON, O&M, and MILPERS is because I got it off of this chart. So that's where I got the information. And remember, when you go after milestone B, that acquisition decision memorandum is a document that's being continuously updated as they're making decisions in the acquisition system. All right, so that's the milestone, that's the life cycle, that's the phases and milestones of the acquisition process. And that's just the short version. When you move on to CDFM Module 4, you'll go into more depth and more information into this process. But that's as much as we're going to go into for that acquisition process. Now I'm going to switch gears because on page 14, 2 to 14, they're going to talk about the acquisition categories. Every acquisition program is labeled in a particular category. The category is primarily based on dollar thresholds or what is already established by the Department of Defense. And they give you some examples there. If it's RDT&E and it's more than 400 million or something like that, but the thresholds are already established to determine whether it's an acquisition category that is handled at the DoD level or if it's handled at the component level. So on the bottom of page 14, anything that's an acquisition category 1 is considered a major defense acquisition program, MDAP, major defense acquisition program, if it's a level 1, acquisition category 1. But there are two subcategories to tell you whether it's a DoD level or it's a component level. So on page, actually we can first look, I like looking at the chart first. The second chart on page 14, the one to the right, goes into the subcategories. A program can either be ACAT-1 Delta or ACAT-1 Charlie. The ACAT-1 Delta, the D behind it, will let you know that it's a DoD level program. So that makes it a lot bit easier to remember. So ACAT-1 Delta is a DoD level program. ACAT 1 Charlie, which is the other subcategory, the C stands for component. So that'll tell you it's handled at the Army level, it's handled at the Navy level in their own acquisitions program. So the Milestone Decision Authority for ACAT 1 Delta, the title of that individual is a Defense Acquisition Executive. And I'll tell you who that person is in a little bit. I'm going to go through these first. The ACAT 1 Charlie, the Milestone Decision Authority for ACAT 1 Charlie is the Component Acquisition Executive. So a lot of them, just like you could be a mother, a sister, a daughter, an aunt, same person, but you can have different titles. So I can be a Milestone Decision Authority. I can be called a Defense Acquisition Executive. I can also be called the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, which is the title of the position of the secretariat that's in charge of acquisition at the DoD level. So if you look, let me see where I saw it. Go back to the slide on the left and you see the second bullet, estimated by the USD A&S in the 2020 book. If you have an older study guide, it's going to say USD ATNL, Acquisition Technology and Logistics. That term has been removed, is changed in the 2020 study guide. The 2020 study guide says the USD A&S, which is Acquisition and Sustainment. So that individual is the Milestone Decision Authority, is the Defense Acquisition Executive for ACAT 1 Delta program. And by the way, don't forget that that's the same person that is the chairman of the Defense Acquisition Board from last week. So you got to tie it all together, same person. So when you look at the bottom of page 14, the top of page 14, they're going into what is exactly on those slides that are already covered. I just like looking at the slides in one shot. What I want to point out at the component level, because there's a note there, you see the highlight, Component Acquisition Executive, the last sentence, 2 components, the U.S. Special Operations Command and DLA, Defense Logistics Agency, have been granted special permission. They have permission to handle their own acquisition responsibilities. That means they have their own component acquisition executive. SOCOM and DLA does not have to go to the Army. They don't have to go to nobody. They have internally, they have been granted the exception to make their own acquisition decision. So know the exceptions to the policy, SOCOM and DLA. You also have acquisition category 1 alpha. Because remember I said you have aircrafts, you have Humvees, you got vehicles, you also have systems. So the systems are categorized as acquisition category 1 alpha programs, which means they're automated information, they're automated, major automated information systems, what they call it, MAZARC, I think is what the term that I understand. Major automated information system. So those are your computer systems, our technology systems. They also have subcategories on the right on page 15, which is ACAT 1 Alpha, is ACAT 1AM, MAZOC, and the M is a DoD level program, and ACAT 1AC, Information Assurance or Information Automation, whatever to help you to remember. 1AC is the component, but the DoD level one is an M for MAZOC. Okay. So ACAT 1 Delta, DoD, ACAT 1 Charlie, major defense acquisition programs is ACAT 1 Delta, ACAT 1 Charlie, and Major Automated Information System, MAIS, is ACAT 1AM for DoD, 1AC for the component level. So those are your two categories of acquisition programs. And on page 16, they mention again the acquisition program baseline. Remember, I mentioned it in the beginning. At milestone B, the program manager develops the acquisition program baseline, that agreement with the milestone decision authority on what the program technically should look like. And then we talked about the analysis of the alternatives and that initial capabilities document. The ICD was that document that the JROC and the vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff produces the initial capabilities document, is producing that process to help them determine what the requirements needs to be for that, to fill that capability gap. At the top of page 17, what I want to point out here as they talk about the analysis of the alternative, remember the key player, the DCAPE, Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation. When you read through this section, you will see that the DCAPE is responsible for developing the analysis of the alternative guidance. Remember, he's the cost guy. So when you do analysis and you're talking about cost, you receive guidance from the DCAPE. Some other things, I'm pausing now to recap some of the things that the DCAPE does. The DCAPE is in charge of the analysis of the alternative guidance, programming phase of P. He's also responsible for updating the future year defense program. So those are a couple of things that we already know that the same DCAPE guy is responsible for. Let's talk about the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment. He's the Senior Acquisition Executive at the DoD. He's the Milestone Decision Authority for ACAT 1 Delta programs and 1A programs, AM. He's the Chairman of the Defense Acquisition Board. What else? And so when you're talking technology, as I'm just recapping something I thought of, the 1AM programs at the DoD, because it's technology, that USD ANS or the Milestone Decision Authority can designate the Chief Information Officer to be in charge. And based on the 2020 study guide, the USD for Research and Engineering is the CIO for the DoD. USD R&E, Research and Engineering, is designated as the Milestone Decision Authority for ACAT 1AM programs. Because again, subject matter expert, technology. So total systems. So we look at a total systems approach from the development of the system. So that's what the phases really represent. Remember, material solution, that's your cradle. You're starting off all the way to disposal, to grave. Cradle to grave. That's the total systems approach. So on page 18 to 18, you have the life cycle costs. And we're going to look at the different way you can get the cost estimates. Because you have to have estimates because you don't know if you're developing something and you don't already have it, you may not know exactly how much it's going to cost. So you have to build cost estimates. So there are 3 ways on the bottom of page 18 that a cost estimates can be developed. You can simply look at the appropriation categories. Everything, your total RDT&E, your total procurement, your total MILCON, your total operation and maintenance and MILPERS. You can add up all those total, that's your cost estimate. You can do WBS, work breakdown structure. And then for each level of work, there's a dollar amount. You add up all the dollar amount, that's your estimate. Or the third one is to look at the life cycle cost categories. And we'll focus more on the third one on next session. But what you're looking at is the research and development. So you're starting from the beginning, then the investment piece of it, then the operation and support piece of it. Remember, operations and support accounts for the majority of the cost in an acquisition program. I repeat, operation and support, that last phase accounts for the majority, the maximum amount, the majority of the dollars spent on a program. And as you're doing cost estimates, don't forget who's helping you out, your program manager. So the program manager on the bottom of 19 develops a CARD, cost analysis requirements description. Whenever you hear cost analysis, understand that the DCAPE is involved in that process. It has to be. He's the senior cost guy at the DOD. So even if they don't say it directly in the paragraph, understand if it's a cost analysis requirements description, the DCAPE had to have given them guidance, had to be involved in that process. But what you need to know from this one, the first bullet tells you program manager prepares the card and it's approved by the program executive office. That's the office that's in charge of several programs, the senior office, the PEO. They approve the card. Let's see. The timeline for the card. The draft card must be submitted 180 days. The final card must be submitted 45 days before the overarching integrated product team. And that overarching integrated product teams are, again, you have individual pockets of things going on, but you need that overarching integrated product team to pull all those pieces together to have that one product, or else you're going to have several responses. So 180 days, the draft, 45 days, the final must be submitted before the planned overarching integrated product team. And you say, well, who is it going to? If you read the last sentence, it's going to the DCAPE. You got to give your cost benefit analysis to the DCAPE so the DCAPE can review it. So card goes to the DCAPE. All right, so this sounds like a good stopping point for this portion of 2.2, and then I'll do a different video as I go into the actual life cycle cost composition, because it's a lot and I want to be able to break out the information a little bit better. All right, so be sure to subscribe, share the information with others, repeat it to make sure you understand, and I'll see you guys again next time.